Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to welcome you to our final Lunch and Learn session, which marks the last day in our Disability Awareness Week. Today, we are delighted to be joined by Michael Barrett, MBE, who will be talking to us about the impact construction sites can have on people with disabilities. FM Conway has benefited from Michael's expertise on a number of initiatives, including the introduction of cargo bikes as a means of delivering resources to our sites in central London, and he regularly conducts 3-tier assessment walks with members of our teams to help ensure we have kept people with different disabilities in mind when setting up our sites. Today, Michael will be talking about the importance of inclusive sites and a means of mitigating for their impact. We hope that this will help offer you the tools needed to create safe, inclusive and efficient sites for all. Thank you very much for joining us this week in this week of disability awareness events, and thank you again to all our wonderful speakers and those who have worked with us to produce such an informative week. I look forward to hearing your feedback and taking these ideas and actions forward in the future, both within FM Conway and the wider community. Thank you.
Morning everybody, my name is Michael Barrett, I'm the Development Impact Manager at TfL. Firstly, I'd like to thank FM Conway for inviting me to present on this Disability Awareness Week, and I'm going to cover the construction impacts on the community, especially ones that cause barriers to access. So you may be wondering what this 20% is. This is a very important number that I'd like everybody to write down now if possible, and something to remember by the end of the presentation. My role tends to focus on major development projects and the associated works. The team that I manage focuses on innovation, efficiency, safety and having an all-inclusive approach. We look at topics such as cargo bikes, HGV management, cycle safety, pedestrian safety, staff training, working with utility companies, also working with the emergency services, and there's a strong focus on the community and access being one of the key points. This is where the 20% comes in. There are over 11 million people with limited long-term illnesses, impairment or disability. Most commonly reported impairment are those that affect mobility, lifting and carrying. 80% of those people have hidden disabilities. So when it comes to legislation, when you're working on the highway, we tend to focus on Chapter 8 and the Red Book Code of Practice, but we don't tend to use the Equality Act. Now, between sections 20 and 22 it states not to disadvantage a disabled person compared to a non-disabled person. Now, what does that mean? I think this is where we need to start having a deeper look in what we're doing and treating how we do things at home the same as how we do things at work. So how we look after our parents, how we look after our children, we wouldn't do the bare minimum. And this is where we need to change our mindsets. Right, so what does disability mean to you? So a lot of people I talk to, and I say, what does that mean? They'll say someone who can't walk or someone who can't see. So we say disability equals barriers to access, and it's the barriers that cause the problems. Now, we've got enough tech in the world we live in today to help people to live life full, and everybody has the right to be able to do what they want. It's the infrastructure around us that causes the disability, and during the temporary environment, this is a big issue. I started with cycling because I think cycling's easier to manage, especially where you've got such a big carriageway that you can share up space compared to the footpath. Now, cyclist dismount sign is probably one of the most hated signs to cyclists. A lot of contractors will say, oh, the cyclists are moaning because they put dismount out. But there's another side to that, and this is where the Equality Act will come in. So I've just shown some stats from Wheels for Wellbeing, who did a study on this with over 200 respondents and looking at how that impacts disabled cyclists. And you can see some of the feedback there is 51% couldn't complete a full journey. 75% use their cycle as a mobility aid, and again 75% find cycling easier than walking. And it's considering, okay, let me go down this road, all of a sudden bang, the road's shut, I've now got to dismount because the sign tells me to do so. Let's have a look at the cyclist dismount sign and use footway. I've put 3 pictures up here that give you a reason why we shouldn't use this sign at all. So if we start with the top right picture, we've got Isabel, who uses an adapted wheelchair. Kevin, who cycles with one leg, he doesn't use a prosthetic limb when he's cycling. So if you ask him to dismount, he would struggle. And the side-by-side cycling, we're trying to encourage more people to get involved with cycling who might not have the same skills to get around. We'd be losing stuff like this if people can't complete a journey. So I'd say in London we're getting quite good at putting cycling facilities around temporary environments, but there might be occasions where we put a facility in that can still cause a barrier to access. I've given an example here of some work we did with FM Conway on Blackfriars Road as part of development works, where to manage two-way cycling we had to use a central island. Now you need a ramp up and a ramp off. Now the ramp off, as you're coming down, had a slight angle, which meant if you're on a three-wheel cycle you could be displaced and fall out. So we worked with Wheels for Wellbeing on how that impacted an adapted wheelchair, and we put super elevation in, so as the cyclist comes round, instead of it being flat where you could displace, the super elevation helps you keep on that bend as if you're on a racetrack. And it's just that little bit extra consideration that makes a big difference. Next section is looking at considering people in the footway, and this to me is the hardest thing that we have to do on all roadworks or interventions on the highway. I'm just going to give a few seconds of pause to give you time to take in what these pictures are showing. And one of the questions I would ask is, did we consider enough during the planning stage of setting this works out? Let's go on to signals. Now, as a non-disabled person, I wouldn't have an issue to be able to reach over to get the push button, or if the push button's on the wrong side of the pole, I would be able to see it, walk around and get to it. Now for Monica, who uses a mobility scooter, this is a challenge. She's in her 80s now. She comes out with me quite a lot. You'll recognise her various pictures along this presentation. And Dave, this was a shot taken in Brighton, and what happened is they'd lifted the pole out from the right hand side of the tactile, put it on the wrong side, but without even turning the push button round. So when he came down the tactile, he found that when he put his arm out, it wasn't there. So we told him it was on the other side, so we then had to walk across the other side to find that he still can't reach it because it's behind the barrier and actually on the wrong side. Should there be an assault course to reach the push button? And the answer is no. There's a couple of examples here. And also how signs can cause issues. So example on the left hand side, yes. Now Monica not reach the push button, she'd have to probably manoeuvre around in a certain way to do it, and it's wasting her time and causing distress. But also the safety factors of where we position signs, and it's important that we keep signal crossings clear for drivers to actually see if somebody does attempt to cross the road. The sign here is actually hiding a lady who uses a wheelchair. You can just about see the wheels underneath the Men at Work sign. So how do we manage this to make it easy access for everybody? Simple things. If you do have poles in barrels, you put a cowl around it, and if you were originally putting a barrier around there, you just put the barrier around the back and just supply access. I want to talk a little bit about footway closures and who they impact. And the two pictures we've got up here, Monica will not be able to get up those stairs, and because one footpath's shut, Isabel and Natalie have to use the other footpath. Now for Natalie, who's got visual impairment, you would not know that, just about to walk into the bench, Isabel will not be able to get down that curb, so then she would have to go back and use the road. This is one thing that we always find that is one of the big issues, is people do not consider the opposite footpath that they're putting people on, and this is where it should be checked. Another example here is Isabel trying to get up a curb, which she can't, and this is a construction site, so whether it's construction sites, utility works, any highway works, it's all got the same impact. Isabel will be forced to use the road. And on the opposite side, because they've shut the main crossing point, there's no drop curb ramp to help somebody get across. So the particular company that we work with there, which is shown on the right hand side, Monica was again helping us assess this. We're putting a little footway for her. Now that should be done in the planning stage. Now on the left hand side, a developer needed to shut the footpath, and the original proposals were to divert pedestrians onto the opposite side. And we said, well, we don't need to do that because we could allocate some of the space for the cycle lane, still maintaining two-way cycling, and put a temporary path. Now, if you're using traffic management barriers, you're looking at a loss of 500 mil already. But by building a new footpath, because this was going to be long-term, we didn't need as much space. Now, when we're talking about ramps, you'll have a typical minimum standard of 1 in 12 gradient. Not all ramps suit everybody. There's some examples here. Now for Eurogale on the left hand side with a short wheelbase, he was nearly toppling backwards by using a standard ramp. And Isabel on the right hand side, she was also struggling with this. And we've also seen a variety of ramps with asphalt or a composite make that just aren't fit for purpose. And what we would say is always try and aim for better. So if you've got the room, put in 1 in 20. Make it as easy as possible. Some of the other examples of where people put ramps, you need turning space when you're using a wheelchair. So there's a couple of examples here. The ramp's placed right by the traffic management, so if you want to turn left, you will go into the feet, so you'd probably have to go right to do a U-turn, then to come back. And on the right hand side, you've got a black asphalt ramp. Now, black asphalt on black asphalt is not ideal, because if you're visually impaired, you might not be able to see it and know that there's an actual ramp there to use. And Eurogale didn't have enough room to spin. And this was a challenge that we had here. So there are some ramps out there, I'm not going to mention names, but are better gradients. You don't have to approach them at perpendicular angle, you can come from the side. But it's also, if you are doing a temporary asphalt ramp, is to make sure there's a good clear contrast. Another issue that we find on some sites that they do not line up, so a visually impaired person using the crossing will walk straight across. Now if it's not lined up like the picture here, you'd be walking into the curb. Right, I'm going to talk about some hidden disabilities. Now there's quite a few that we have to consider, so I've just focused on dyspraxia, dyslexia, autism, visual impairment, which we've talked about already, but there's things like arthritis, mental health that we don't consider when we're doing works, because they can all cause a lot of distress to people, and if people get distressed then it can impact on our NHS. So top left, so we're talking about dyslexia and dyspraxia. Now can people read that? You've got overkill with the amount of signs, the amount of reading somebody has to do. For dyspraxia, that can cause distress with multiple messaging coming at you. For dyslexia, you might not be able to pick up and understand what the signs are trying to say. For a visually impaired person, now I'll use an example of Natalie, who's on the bottom side. She has told me that she reads all the signs to understand what they're trying to tell her. Now how long that would take on the top picture, who knows. Now when you're talking about autism, some children who are brought up with routine do not like to have their routine changed. And a friend of mine's daughter will have a breakdown if she gets put on that. So if you shut a footpath and send somebody on a diversion, there could be an issue coming there. And this is one of the things is we try not to close a footpath. Now for adults with learning disabilities, there are some other impacts that we don't think about. So this is Isabel, this is my friend's cousin, who I've been out for a number of walks. She follows signs as they tell her to do so. An example of these two signs is one sign is potentially sending her into the road, which she is likely to follow. The other one is sending both ways. Now one way is into the River Thames and the other way is to set around a set of works. That could cause just distress because she wouldn't be able to make her mind up which way to go. Bus stops, big issue again. A lot of people rely on buses, local communities, older people, a lot of disabled people who can't drive will use a bus. Now, if you shut a bus stop, you're then taking away their transportation. Do we need to close the bus stop? Potentially, a lot of the time we do. But the guidance that we supply is you have a temporary dolly as close to that bus stop as possible. If the curb height doesn't meet the standard where a ramp can be deployed, then that person might need to walk another 400 metres. Now that could cause that person not to go out at all because they can't do that kind of distance. An example here on the left hand side is where a developer needed to shut 2 key bus stops in Ilford. The nearest curb, which is just outside the library, was not high enough, so we made it high enough. And that was in for a long period of time. Now, as well as all this, some of the stuff that I've been showing you, there's a lot of other hazards that we don't think about. Cable ties that haven't been cut. Children, people who use wheelchairs, people who are visually impaired, that can take out somebody's eye. Even when your mirrors on your truck, if you leave them out, somebody could walk into it because we assume that somebody would be able to see it when they're walking past. And trip hazards. Now, trip hazards can happen to anybody, so if you walk along with your phone, this is an issue, but do we check it? You know, and a lot of sites don't, and this is one of the things that we have problems with. Right, I've used this picture again to just give you an example of how many people we impact on by what we do. So we've talked about a disabled cyclist, would they be able to dismount? We've talked about the confusing signage. Would somebody who's visually impaired be able to negotiate this site? If somebody uses a wheelchair, would they be able to come down the ramp and turn sufficiently to go down the cycle path? Also, for somebody using a wheelchair, would they be able to spot that the ramp's nearly falling off on the opposite side? Would they risk then going down there to use that ramp, or would they go back down to the bottom of the bridge and go round again? Now, let me just stop a minute. So, the presentation I've just done, I've said, look at these slides. I've been talking over the pictures. I've not really written a lot of information. I might have been too technical in the conversation. There's a lot of people that wouldn't be able to get access to the presentation I've just given, so do I need to go back and start again to make sure everybody's considered when I do a presentation? And we don't do things like this. Now, if you then place that into works, the reactive issues are the costs that come with it. Now, Michael, you've just caused my day to be doom and gloom. There is hope at the end of the tunnel, and this is something I'd like to talk about now. Okay. So, I am not a specialist on disability. I don't think I would even like to say that, because the spectrum of that I would need to consider is huge, and every community is different, every person is different. So the best person that I should be getting involved with understanding how that person is impacted is somebody from that local community. Now, the 3-tier assessment, which is nothing to do with the government 3-tier, this is pre-COVID. It involves a local community where you're about to start works. So tier 1, meet the local community, and this example is people from Moorfields Eye Hospital, as well as a lady who lives locally, uses a wheelchair. Go for a walk around the area, find out their challenges, and think about it. So you're going to learn. The same with local cycling. So get out with a local cycle group, cycle around the area, get their feedback on how it is, how safe it feels. If it doesn't feel safe, you need to start thinking a little bit more. Now, tier 2, you've learned some new stuff of that local demographic. Include that in your traffic management design. So if you need to shut a footpath, what is the consideration of what's the other footpath like? If you need to put ramps in, what kind of gradient do you need to put in? How wide should the temporary footpath be? Then you're going through the works. If you can't get any cycle infrastructure in, is there a safe alternative? Now, you bring in the local cycle group, they will know the area, they can advise you best on that. And it just gives you a better package of what you're doing. Tier 3 is meet with the same people again and test it. See how it is to cycle through the works if you need to make some tweaks. Is it okay for a wheelchair to get through? Is it okay for a visually impaired? Will somebody with a learning disability understand what you're trying to show them to get through your site? Is there too much signage? Are you hiding people behind signals? Little things like this, and you can make those little tweaks instead of doing the big reactive costs that we talked about earlier. Right, we all have a duty of care with what we do. There's corporate social responsibility, blah, blah, blah. Now, people on the ground, we've set something up called the 3-tier assessment. This is a nice, easy methodology you can put into play to make sure you consider as much of the community as possible. But for senior management who don't tend to get out on site as often, we can take you out on walks, we can take you out on rides called constructive cycle experience and environmental impact walks. All you need to do, give us a shout, and it gives you a better understanding. So when things are fed up from your teams, you've now got an understanding of what we need to do that better style of working. We've also got a setup called Value in People workshops, where it's spending time with people with learning disabilities and understanding their needs. And what we're doing now is learning more. What do we need to consider? And if you're going to have an all-inclusive approach, it means we have to consider everybody with what we do. Now, the final slide is about reflection. And I'm not going to say that it's obvious there, because not everybody's going to be able to see this slide. But we can make a difference. I've put a little quote in there: if we all go above and beyond, beyond becomes business as usual. And this is something what we want to aim at. So we don't want it to become a chore that you have to do all this extra stuff. We should be doing that anyway. And then when you get used to doing it, it'll just be standard practice. And this is all about raising standards. Thank you very much for your time. I know this has been quite a challenging topic to talk about, but we need to talk about it and we need to consider it. Thank you.